Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to tonight's broadcast, A Place for Stories. Tonight's submission comes from someone who asked to remain completely anonymous. He worked overnight ranch security in the South Texas brush, where the nearest town was miles away, and most nights were spent surrounded by nothing but darkness, mesquite trees, and silence. He says that what happened during one particular night shift changed the way he looked at the darkness forever. To this day, he refuses to work overnight anywhere, and he still won't answer his name if he hears someone calling for him after midnight. As always, these stories are shared for entertainment. Whether you believe them or not, I'll let you decide. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. This is The Shadows Beyond the Floodlights. Hi, tonight's broadcast. You can keep me anonymous. I've thought about sending this story in for a long time because, honestly, I still don't know how to explain what happened. Most people would probably tell me I was tired or imagining things, and maybe that's true. But there were three of us there that night, and all three of us experienced the same thing. This happened in South Texas about 4 years ago. At the time, I was 24 years old and working overnight ranch security on one of the largest private ranches in the area. It wasn't a dangerous job. Most nights were spent checking locked gates, making sure nobody was trespassing, and keeping an eye on expensive equipment scattered around the property. The ranch headquarters sat almost in the middle of nowhere. There was a small office, a maintenance shop, and a fenced equipment yard surrounded by tall floodlights. Once those lights ended, all you could see was miles of mesquite brush. Usually, there were only three of us working nights. One person stayed at the headquarters to monitor cameras and answer the radio, while the other two drove patrol in opposite directions around the ranch. I had only been there about 8 months. The other two officers had been doing it for years. One was in his 40s and joked about everything. The other was close to 60 and hardly spoke unless he had something important to say. One night, while we were drinking coffee before starting patrol, the older man looked at me and asked if I had ever heard voices out in the brush. I laughed. I figured he was trying to scare the new guy. He didn't laugh. Instead, he quietly said, "If somebody calls your name after midnight, don't answer." That was it. No explanation, no story. He grabbed his truck keys and walked outside. For the next few weeks, nothing unusual happened. If anything, the job became predictable. I'd listen to country music, drive dusty ranch roads, watch deer cross in front of the headlights, and wait for sunrise. Then came a Thursday night in late October. It had rained earlier that afternoon, leaving the air strangely quiet. Around midnight, the other two officers left headquarters to check a broken fence several miles away, leaving me alone to watch the cameras. About 20 minutes later, one of the motion alarms went off near the equipment yard. I pulled up the camera, and there was nothing. No people, no animals. Just the fence and dark brush beyond it. I figured a rabbit had triggered the sensor. 5 minutes later, another alarm activated. It was a different camera. Same result. Empty. I was about to dismiss it when I heard something outside. I heard footsteps. Slow footsteps crunching across the gravel. Not running, not sneaking, just walking. I looked through the front window. The floodlights lit up the entire yard. There was nobody. The footsteps continued. They circled the office. I grabbed my flashlight and walked towards the front door. Then I remembered what the other officer had said. If someone calls your name after midnight, don't answer. I didn't know why that crossed my mind, but it stopped me from opening the door. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, there was complete silence. Then, three soft knocks hit the metal wall beside the office window. Every hair on my arm stood up. I called the other officers over the radio. "Hey, are either of you back already?" The younger one answered immediately. "No, we're still about 10 minutes away." Before I could reply, I heard a man's voice outside. "Hello?" It sounded far away, like someone standing just beyond the floodlights. Can't anybody hear me? I walked to the side window and carefully looked through the blinds, and there was nothing, just darkness. The voice came again, closer this time. Please. It wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate, it almost sounded calm, too calm. Then my radio came alive. The older officer's voice cut through the static. Don't answer him. I froze. I hadn't told him what I was hearing. I asked, how did you know? There was a long pause before he answered. Because we heard him too. That made no sense. They were several miles away. I looked back towards the window. The voice called again. Except this time, it wasn't a man anymore. It was a woman. Soft. Gentle. Then she said my first name. I wish I could explain what that felt like. It wasn't just someone saying my name. It was my mother's voice. Exactly the way she sounded when she'd call me inside for dinner when I was a kid. She lives in New Mexico. There was no possible way she could have been standing outside that office. Still, for just a second, I believed it. I actually reached for the doorknob. Then the older officer yelled over the radio, "Don't open the door." I stepped back immediately. Outside, everything became quiet again. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I kept staring out the window, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That's when every motion sensor around headquarters activated at once. Every single one. The camera monitor filled with alerts. I pulled up the first camera. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third. I stopped breathing. At the very edge of the floodlights, just beyond where the lights touched the brush, something was standing there. It looked like a person, except it was completely black. No face, no clothes, no details. Just the shape of someone watching the office. Then another appeared. Then another. By the time I switched to the last camera, there were shadows standing around almost every side of headquarters. None of them moved. None of them crossed into the light. They simply stood there, watching. And that's when the floodlights went out. It felt like the entire ranch disappeared. One moment I could see the equipment yard, the fence, and the brush beyond it. The next, nothing. It was just dark. It was the kind of darkness that makes you feel like something could be standing inches away without you ever knowing. The office was completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner had stopped. I grabbed my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, the older officer came over the radio. Don't. His voice was calm. Almost too calm. Leave it off. I whispered back. The power's out. I know. There was a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. If they're out there, don't give them a reason to know exactly where you are. My stomach dropped. I wanted to ask him what he meant by they. Instead, I stood perfectly still. Outside, I heard gravel crunching. Not one step of footsteps, several. Slow, deliberate, circling the office. It sounded like people casually walking around the building. Every few seconds, they stopped. Then started again. I tried counting them, immediately remembering the older officer's warning. Don't count them. I stopped. The footsteps continued. Then something slowly dragged across the outside wall. It sounded like fingernails on metal. The noise traveled from one end of the building and all the way to the other. I don't mind admitting it, I was terrified. Then the voices started. At first, it sounded like people talking somewhere out in the brush, too far away to understand. Gradually, they became clearer. A little girl crying, a man coughing, someone asking for water, another voice praying in Spanish. They weren't loud. If anything, that made it worse. Every voice sounded tired, like people who had been wandering for days. I reached for the radio. The younger officer finally spoke. I can hear them too. His voice was shaking. The older officer answered immediately. I know. The younger man asked the question we were all thinking. What are we supposed to do? There was another long silence. Then the older man quietly replied, We wait for daylight. Just then, someone knocked on the office door. 3 slow knocks. Not hard, almost polite. Nobody moved. A woman's voice spoke from the other side. Can you help me? I felt every instinct telling me to unlock that door. The older officer shouted through the radio, Stop. His voice snapped me back to reality. Before I could answer, the emergency generator finally started. With a loud roar, the floodlights flashed back to life. The cameras rebooted one by one. The office lights flickered. Everything outside became visible again. The footsteps stopped immediately. The voices disappeared. The silence was almost worse. I walked over to the camera monitor. Every outside camera was working again. The first camera showed the front gate, empty. The second, empty. The third, I froze. Standing just beyond the reach of floodlights was one of those shadows. Perfectly still, I switched cameras. Another shadow. Different side of the headquarters. Another camera. Another one. It wasn't one figure. There were several. None of them moved. None crossed into the light. The younger officer's truck finally pulled into the yard. He jumped out before it even stopped rolling and ran inside. His face was pale. I saw them, he said. I thought they were trees until one of them turned its head. A few seconds later, the older officer walked in. Unlike the rest of us, he didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed, like he'd been hoping this day would never come again. He walked straight to the monitor, studied the cameras for several seconds, then quietly pulled every blind close. I asked him what those things were. He looked at me for a long moment. I've worked ranches since I was 17, he said. I've only seen them 3 times. What are they? He slowly shook his head. I don't know. Have they hurt anyone? He hesitated. I've never stayed long enough to find out. None of us spoke for several minutes. Then curiosity got the better of me. I lifted one corner of the blinds, just enough to peek outside. The figures were still there. Only now, one of them was inside the fence. I slammed the blind shut. The younger officer looked at me. How many? Before I could answer, the older man interrupted. Don't say it. I hadn't even realized I started counting. He walked over and gently lowered the blind completely. Never count them. I finally asked him why. He took a deep breath. My grandfather worked cattle on this ranch long before any of these buildings were here. He told me that if you count them, they know you can see them. Nobody laughed. Nobody questioned him. A few minutes later, 3 soft knocks echoed against the office window. We all turned. Nobody was standing outside. Then, a voice came through the glass. It was my voice. Not similar, not close. It was mine. There are 8. The words were spoken exactly the way I would have said them. Then, whoever or whatever was outside laughed, using my laugh. Every one of us heard it. The younger officer backed away from the window. The older man simply closed his eyes, almost like he'd expected it. None of us went outside again that night. We stayed inside until the eastern sky finally began turning gray. As daylight spread across the brush, the figures slowly disappeared. Not by walking away, not by fading. It was almost like the sunlight erased them. When morning finally arrived, we searched every inch of headquarters. There was no footprints, no tire tracks, no sign anyone had been there. Only one thing seemed out of place. On the dust covering the office window, someone had drawn a single line with one finger. Beneath it were 8 long marks, like someone had been keeping count. I left that job about 6 weeks later. The younger officer transferred to another ranch. The older man retired the following spring. Before I left, I asked him one last question. I said, if they're still out there, why hasn't anyone done something about it? He smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Then he said, son, this ranch has been here for over 100 years. I don't think we were here first. I've never gone back. I don't work nights anymore. But every now and then, if I'm driving through the South Texas brush after dark, I'll catch myself looking beyond the reach of my headlights. Sometimes, for just a second, I think I see someone standing there, completely still, waiting for me to notice them. So I keep driving. I don't slow down. I don't roll down the window. And no matter what I think I hear, I never answer when someone calls my name after midnight. Our second submission tonight comes from someone who spent more than 15 years working as a wildlife officer in South Texas. Unlike our first story, there's nothing supernatural about what happened to him. No shadows, no unexplained voices, just miles of isolated brush, and the terrifying realization that someone was watching him from the darkness. He asked to remain anonymous, and after hearing his account, I think you'll understand why. This is Someone Was Hunting Us. Hi, tonight's broadcast. I'd like to stay anonymous. I worked as a wildlife officer in South Texas for a little over 15 years. During that time, I dealt with everything from poachers to injured animals to lost hikers and trespassers. Most people assume the job is exciting every night, but the truth is, most shifts are quiet. You spend hours driving ranch roads, checking water tanks, responding to reports from landlords, and hoping nothing serious happens. That's exactly how the night I'm about to tell you started. I was 39 years old and had been on night patrol for several years. It was late November, cold enough to leave the truck's windows cracked. The moon was barely visible behind the clouds, and the brush seemed darker than usual. Around 10:30 that night, dispatch called about a rancher who had reported hearing gunshots in his property. Hunting season had already ended there, so I figured someone had slipped onto the ranch after dark. That wasn't unusual. I drove out to meet the ranch owner. He was waiting at the front gate with a flashlight and looked more irritated than frightened. He told me he'd heard the 3 gunshots about an hour earlier, then saw someone walking through the brush carrying what looked like a rifle. He pointed me towards an old ranch road and said the man disappeared in that direction. I thanked him and started searching. About a mile in, I found fresh boot prints crossing the road. Only one person. The tracks were deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. I followed them into the brush. After about 15 minutes, I found an abandoned campsite. There wasn't much there: a small fire pit, an empty cooler, a folding chair. Everything looked like someone had packed up in a hurry. What caught my attention was the food. There were canned goods, bottled water, and enough supplies for someone to stay there for weeks. As I looked around, my flashlight landed on something hanging from a mesquite branch: a hunting license. It belonged to a man reported missing nearly 2 weeks earlier. My stomach tightened. I immediately radioed dispatch and requested another officer. While I waited, I kept searching. About 30 yards from the campsite, I found a backpack. Inside were a wallet, a flashlight, and truck keys. None of them belonged to the same person as the hunting license. That was enough for me to stop searching alone. 20 minutes later, another wildlife officer arrived. He'd worked with me for years, and we agreed something wasn't right. We decided to follow the boot prints together. They continued deeper into the ranch before disappearing on a rocky creek bed. As we searched for the trail again, we heard a whistle, one short whistle, somewhere behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing. A few minutes later, another whistle, this time from our left. It sounded like someone trying to get another person's attention. We called out, but there was no answer. The brush went silent. Then my partner quietly said, "We're being watched." I wanted to tell him he was overreacting, but I felt it too. You know that feeling when the back of your neck starts tingling for no reason? That's exactly what hit both of us. We started walking back towards our trucks, slowly, without taking our eyes off the trees. Halfway there, we heard footsteps, not running, just matching our pace somewhere in the brush. Every time we stopped, The footsteps stopped. Every time we walked, they started again. Whoever it was stayed hidden. My partner raised his flashlight towards the sound. For just a second, I saw someone standing between two mesquite trees, head to toe in camouflage, holding what looked like a hunting rifle. The second the light hit him, he stepped backward and disappeared. We radioed dispatch again. This time, we requested sheriff's deputies. Dispatch told us to stay where we were. That wasn't possible. The footsteps had started moving again, closer now. Then we heard another whistle, except this one came from behind us. We turned. No one. Then another whistle from our right. It suddenly hit me. There wasn't just one person. There were at least two, maybe more. We picked up our pace. The trucks were only a few hundred yards away when something hit the dirt road in front of us. A bullet. Neither of us waited to see where it came from. We ran. Another shot echoed through the brush. Then another. Branches exploded behind us. We reached the trucks, jumped inside, and used them to cover while waiting for backup. Within minutes, sheriff's deputies arrived along with additional wildlife officers. The area was searched until sunrise. They found several hidden camps scattered throughout the brush. Inside were canned foods, sleeping bags, extra clothing, and personal belongings from multiple missing hunters, wallets, backpacks, cell phones. But whoever had been living out there was gone. The investigation lasted for weeks. No arrests were ever made. The official theory was that someone had been hiding on abandoned ranch property and targeting hunters who wandered too far from established trails. What still bothers me is what happened 6 months later. I was checking another ranch almost 40 miles away when I noticed fresh boot prints crossing the road. The tread pattern looked familiar. I convinced myself it was just coincidence. Then I found something hanging from a fence post. It was an old hunting license, the same missing hunter's license we'd recovered months earlier. I know that's impossible. The evidence had been logged by investigators. But I know what I saw. I didn't pick it up. I turned around, got back in my truck, and called it in from the driver's seat. I never searched that area by myself again. People often ask me why I retired early than I planned. I usually tell them I was ready for a quieter life. The truth is, I realized that night there are places in South Texas brush where someone can watch you for hours without you ever knowing they're there. And if the wrong person decides you're the one they're hunting, the darkness gives them every advantage. That brings us to the end of tonight's broadcast. A big thank you to the anonymous contributors who shared their unsettling experiences. Whether you believe every detail or think there's another explanation, I'll leave that up to you. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which one stayed with you the most? Was it the mysterious shadows beyond the floodlights, or the terrifying realization that someone was hunting in the darkness? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have your own strange, unexplained, and unforgettable experience you'd like to share, please email me at tonightsbroadcast77@gmail.com. Your story could be featured in a future episode of tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and allow me to bring you more stories just like these. Until next time, lock your doors, keep your lights on, and if you ever find yourself alone in the South Texas brush after midnight, whatever you do, don't answer when someone calls your name. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next broadcast. Until the shadows call again. Good night.